Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. In this week's episode, we're going to talk about the hot topic in real estate this week, the investigation into BC Housing and Atira Women's Resource Society. It's complete. There are findings. They are not good. We're going to talk about conflict of interest in real estate. So if you're working with a buyer's agent or a seller's agent, how you can avoid certain types of conflict that could affect you negatively. And of course, as always, going to wrap it up with a very brief market update. Real quick, before we get started, if this is your first time to the channel, my name is Hassan. I'm a real estate agent in the Vancouver area, and I make educational real estate content to help you on your real estate journey. I also make content designed to help you make your move in and around Vancouver. So if that sounds interesting to you, you can book a 30-minute call with me in the Calendly link below, or just send me a text, shoot me a message, whatever's easiest for you. Subscribe to this channel regardless so you don't miss a future video. All right, to start off this week's episode, we're going to talk about BC Housing, Atira Women's Resource Society, and a conflict of interest that started back in 2010, went to an investigation starting last year, and it found a whole host of mismanagement of money, conflict of interest between two organizations, BC Housing and Atira Women's Society. To give you a bit of background, where the conflict came into play is the CEO, the former CEO of BC Housing, and the CEO of Atira were husband and wife. Now, as mentioned, this conflict began in 2010 when this relationship began, but ultimately what the findings were for this report is this resource society, they were the largest recipient of funding from BC Housing. And when this relationship began, the BC Housing, the former CEO, signed off on a declaration of the conflict of interest and said that they would not be involved in any way with any decisions involved with Atira, and ultimately it found that over 25 times that was not the case. The former CEO of BC Housing was involved. There was misappropriation of funds in the sense that when they hit certain thresholds, they were supposed to go to alternate approvals before allowing the funding. That was foregone. Lower level employees at BC Housing were told to just make it happen, do what it takes. If you can imagine this, if you can picture this, so the Premier started this investigation when he was the housing minister last summer. And, as we're told, it was literally, you can probably picture a Netflix documentary like this. It was literally suits from Toronto, hopping on a plane, flying out here for the investigation, confiscating cell phones, confiscating documents, confiscating databases. And at that time as well, they also found that the former CEO of BC Housing and CFO were deleting texts on a daily basis. Now, this all kind of came to a head when the Atira Women's Society were going to purchase a building in the downtown east side for much more than its assessed value, not good value essentially. And one of the board members, stepped up in a meeting and said, I don't agree with this. I'm not voting for it. The meeting minutes were actually changed after the fact to not show that one person was not voting for it. The minutes were changed. In fact, in that purchase, this resource society used funds that weren't allocated to them. They used funds to make the purchase, restricted funds. They went to BC Housing after and said, we need these funds. A month later, I believe it was $2 million, went back to the resource society so they could purchase this building at a price higher than market value. Now, with Atira Women's Society, when it came to their expenses and their costs, they were typically had the highest administration fees out of the other funding recipients. So their costs were a lot higher. They haven't really responded to this investigation. They're showing faith in their CEO is still going to follow through and be able to carry them through this. Housing Minister and David Eby not happy with this response. Now, the first thing to say is that this is so upsetting and disappointing to see that this conflict of interest started in 2010. A declaration was signed, but where was the oversight and where was the follow-up? Why would this only come to light in the last year and a half, that there could be some issues here that would require some investigation? Is it right? Is it fair to just sign off on a declaration, tuck it away, and act like it doesn't exist? Because that's almost what it seems has happened. Now, what's happening on a move forward basis and why I think affordable housing is going to be affected in a negative way is, number one, Atira's funding is frozen. So BC Housing is not going to send funds in that direction. Right now, they're doing more investigations in terms of the status of the buildings that Atira owns and operates. So they're going to be doing inspections there, but no funding heading that way. And some other recommendations in the report were stricter guidelines, obviously, on how they allocate funds to the different organizations. So it's doing two things. Number one, it's going to slow down the flow of money into homes that the people who need them the most, they are not going to have access to those homes. It's going to slow down. And a lot of times these organizations have to be very nimble to be able to provide the housing that's necessary. We're already falling behind. So unfortunately, that flow of funds is going to be much slower. Atira Women's Society, they obviously focus on housing for women and children and those most living in compromised situations that would need that housing more urgently, and now they don't have a flow of funds for that. So this is going to have a definite impact on affordable housing, and again, the flow of money into these organizations, many of which are deserving of the money and they're putting it in the right places. So it's a big hit on affordable housing. So on this topic of conflict of interest, let's talk about conflict of interest in terms of how it could affect you as a consumer, as a buyer or a seller of real estate. Now, several years back, one of the largest conflict of interest opportunities or possibilities, I should say, in BC was removed, and that was the ability for agents to represent both the buyer and the seller in a transaction as a client. When you think about it, if I have a seller client and I'm to act in their best interest, how is it possible for me to represent a buyer in that same transaction and also represent their best interest? So that type of a scenario, which in the industry was referred to as double ending, has been removed. That would have been one of the larger conflict of interest out there. So that's been removed. There are still instances now where a buyer could come to me on my listing and say, look, Hassan, I don't need any advice. Don't tell me anything about the property. I just need you to write a contract. No advice, just write a contract. This is what I want on the contract. In that scenario, that buyer would be a customer of mine and the seller would still be a client. More often than not, most agents are just recommending to that buyer to find their own agent because there's value in having someone that's looking out for your best interest. But that's kind of the larger conflict of interest you might see out there. Two I want to talk about, one on the seller side, one on the buyer side, is more prevalent in a low inventory environment like we're in today. So this will be pretty useful. If you're a seller and you're speaking with your agent, one of the things you want to discuss is what happens in this scenario that I just spoke about. If your listing agent gets a call from one of their own buyers who they've worked with in the past that would want to write an offer or wants to come and view your property. Now, in a low inventory environment, this is pretty common. There's not a lot of product out there and there's a lot of people searching for the same stuff. So this is a question that you want to ask your real estate agent. Say, what would happen if you get that phone call? And you as the seller, you're going to dictate how that's going to work. Oftentimes the listing agent will remain representing you as the client and they'll send their former client to someone else, tell them to go get another agent. But you want to have these discussions so you know what could happen. In our business, when there is a conflict of interest or even a perceived conflict of interest, now we're to notify you right away. So if someone were to call me and I was listing your property and as a client of mine saying, I'm not sure, I'm just asking some questions on the property, we would then come to you and say, look, there could be a potential conflict of interest here. These are the options. How would you like to see this play out and how would you like me to handle it? Now, circling back to the buyer side, I had a buyer I was working with ask me a really good question. This was a couple months ago. We've since found a property, but he said, Hassan, how many buyers do you have that you're working with today that have the same criteria and are looking for the same type of property that I am today? And it was a really good question because it was based on the fact that when listings are low, agents might have 3 or 4 different buyers that want the same type of property. And how are they working that angle? Now, if you're a buyer, you may not even realize that. You might be thinking you're the first person to see these properties that the agent is sending your way, but that's not always the case. Imagine the agent has 5 or 7 people that are looking for the same property. How are your interests being protected? So that's a really good question that you want to ask your agent. Say, what would happen in this scenario? How many people do you have that are looking for what I'm looking for? How do I know that my interest is being protected over any other buyers you might have? So that's something that you want to ask your agent on both the seller and the buyer side. Now, in terms of the real estate market overall, still very, very hot. I've had clients that are looking at different types of property, both in Metro Vancouver and the Fraser Valley. What I can tell you is in the Fraser Valley, it seems like the hot product right now is definitely that townhome. Not a lot of quantity, especially Cloverdale, Langley. I was speaking to an agent friend of mine, and he has been writing offers for clients for over a month and a half or so. And the offers he's writing today are $100,000 more than they were 6 weeks ago, because that's how much prices are heading upwards. Now, not a lot of them are necessarily closing at this value. And I think when they were originally writing offers, they were writing them perhaps lower than where market was at. So obviously they weren't winning those offers. So that's not to say that in 6 weeks prices have gone up that much, but you can see the acceleration of prices across all product types, Metro Vancouver and the Fraser Valley. Listings still very low. It'll be interesting to see what happens in the summer as listings tend to drop off even further. I think if you're a seller and you have a product or you have something that you're considering selling, and listings do slow down from where they are already at low levels today, you're in really good shape heading into the summer. Buyers are a lot more excited and they're feeling safer with the consistency from the Bank of Canada. So I don't think the buyer demand is going to go anywhere. I think we're going to shift even more into a seller's market as we head into the summer. So there you go, guys. I hope you learned something in this week's episode. If you did, hit the like button, because what that does is it takes the video and it sends it out to more people so they can learn from it as well. And also, if you enjoy this real estate content, subscribe to this channel so you don't miss a future video. Lastly, if you want to talk about your own real estate situation, I'm always here to chat with you. You can book me in the Calendly link below, or you can just send me a text, give me a call, shoot me an email, whatever you prefer. Happy to talk with you one-on-one. But outside of that, I hope you guys have a wonderful week, and I look forward to seeing you next week in next week's episode.